Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all very much for joining us today and taking time out of what we know everyone, this is the time of the semester when everybody starts having very busy schedules. So we very much appreciate everyone coming to join us to speak about, but anyways, for everyone to join us to speak about the hidden caliphate. I was quite amused today to walk into my office and see there's a sign that says, conference room 1, the hidden caliphate, and I have to take a sign of that for posterity. It's just like, well, it's not so hidden anymore, is it? Joining us for the presentation is Dr. Waleed Ziad. He is the Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to this, he was the Islamic Law and Civilization Research Fellow at Yale Law School. He completed his PhD in the Department of History at Yale University, where he won the university-wide Field Prize, one of the 2 highest Yale Doctorate Dissertation Awards across all disciplines. He also received his MA and MPhil and BA from, you guessed it, Yale University. All right, for over a decade, Dr. Ziad has conducted fieldwork on historical contemporary religious revivalism and Sufism in over 140 towns across Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. He really is the leading scholar in this particular area of study, and this is why we have him here. Dr. Ziad has studied Persian, Urdu, Arabic, French, Sindhi, Uzbek, Chagatai, and Romanian. I'm not sure why you did Romanian, but maybe we'll have that conversation. Yeah. Is pursuing a girl or who's that? So his book, The Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and Indus, was awarded the 2022 Albert Harani Award for the most prestigious book prize in Middle East Studies and the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Award in 2023, and was shortlisted for the Bloomsbury Pakistan Book Award and the British Association for South Asian Studies Book Award. He also recently published in the Treasure Room for the Sakra King, votive coinage from Gandham shrines, and his forthcoming books include Sufi Masters of the Afghan Empire, Bibi Sahiba, and her Spiritual Network, which I'm very much looking forward to myself, and Beyond the Khutbah and Sikha, Sovereignty and Coinage in Sindh. His articles on historical and ideological trends in the Muslim world have appeared in the New York Times, International Herald Tribune, and Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Christian Science Monitor, and The Hill, among others. Now, before we welcome him, let me just quickly also introduce our discussant. We're very fortunate to have with us Zachary Valentine Wright, who is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at our sister institution, Northwestern Qatar. His work very much complements that of Dr. Ziad in that they're looking at the same types of networks, but in different regions. Whereas Dr. Ziad is focusing upon the subcontinent and Central Asia, Dr. Wright is focusing upon African Sufi organizations and the history and development of African Sufi groups. So his current research concerns 18th century Islamic intellectual history in North Africa, the history of Muslim societies in West Africa, Islamic intellectual history and learning practices in West and North Africa, 19th century to the present, Islamic revival in the Middle East and Africa, in particular the networks of Islamic reforms spanning the Muslim world in the 18th century, and how they inspired social religious movements in the 19th century, as well as contemporary theology in the Muslim world. He has his Arabic, oh, you did an MA at AUC? I never even knew that, mashallah, because I used to teach at AUC. And his history, he received his PhD from Northwestern University and a BA from Stanford University. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ziad, and after his presentation on the Hidden Caliphate, we'll have an interaction with Dr. Wright, and I'll moderate in case things get out of hand. Inshallah. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for, is this on?
No.
No? All right, let's see. What do I press? That's better? Okay, lovely. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm honored on at least 3 counts. first of all, that you took the time out of your day at a specifically, let's say, busy time of the year to be with us. Second, to meet my very old friend, Zachary Wright, who, in fact, we spent a summer together in Cairo probably 21 years ago, and have been seeing each other intermittently since. And Dr. Lombard, I was but a child, an undergraduate, when you were doing your doctorate, in fact alongside my sister, so I was looking up to you as a grown-up, and it is absolutely an honor to be here on the same table as you. So today, it is, let's say, the fourth honor to talk about my first book, Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and Indus, which is a story that takes us across Asia, from Afghanistan to Siberia to the borders of China, based on about a decade of fieldwork across mostly Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So I'm going to start by introducing the geography, and then the subjects of my book, the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufis. Just to get a show of hands, how many here would be familiar with the Mujaddidi Sufi Tariqa? Okay, quite a few hands here, but thank you so much for letting me know. Then the key interventions this book makes, a bit about the structure, a brief look at the protagonist of the book in two great cities, Peshawar, which is now in northwestern Pakistan towards the Afghan border, and Bukhara, now in Uzbekistan, which will bring to surface the existence of an intellectual spiritual network that held together the fabric of much of Asia. The network that is either not known or not spoken about, and certainly obliterated from colonial and modern nation-state narratives, perhaps deliberately. Now, I'll take a moment to place us in the space we are about to enter. And I realize it will be unfamiliar to some of us, so bear with me. I'm going to stand up for a moment. So this is our palette, right? We're dealing here with Afghanistan today, Pakistan, India, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan up here. Let's begin with the two rivers. The Indus River flows from the Himalayas down through Pakistan, sort of the dividing line between generally Persian-speaking Khorasan and the Indic languages and the cultures that go along with it. Over here, so there's your line 1, and the line 2 is running across here. These are the more modern borders between Afghanistan and Central Asia, which is the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River. Now, the story is set against the backdrop of some dramatic changes that are happening across Central Asia, Afghanistan, and South Asia in the 18th century. The three great empires, the Mughals, the Safavids, and the Uzbeks were breaking apart. The Safavids broke apart. And out of the chaos, a brilliant, ruthless, and rather problematic Iranian soldier of fortune, Nadir Shah, carved out a vast empire from the Caucasus to India, one of the last great conquerors. And then he died in 1747, rather abruptly, leaving a total vacuum. After this, bit by bit, a slew of new states gradually start emerging. And where do they start emerging? Places like Shiraz in Iran. You've got, in Uzbekistan today, the Khanate of Khiva, the Khanate of Bukhara, the Khanate of Kokand. In Pakistan today, we've got Sindh, we've got the state of Kalat in Balochistan, and so on and so forth. But the most important of these states, however, was built by Nadir Shah's talented Afghan commander, Ahmad Shah Durrani. And this was the Durrani Afghan Empire, at its height stretching literally from Iran all the way to Delhi and beyond. And it's an empire that lasted only a few generations, but few today realize had a lasting impact on revitalizing the Muslim world. This dynamic period also witnessed the proliferation of an intricate network of shrines, of Sufi centers and madrasas, of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi order, and I'll be shortening this to Mujaddidi. So this is a new term that several of you, I will request, should keep in mind. This particular Sufi path had originated some generations earlier with Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, who passed away in 1624, a mystic known as the reviver, Mujaddid, of the second Islamic millennium. Hence his followers were called Mujaddidis. Among Sirhindi's many intellectual contributions, and you can certainly ask your dean about this who teaches his collected letters, were reconciling the Sufi path and the outward elements of Sharia into a cohesive system, demonstrating that the outer and the inward dimensions of Islam, Sharia, Tasawwuf, could not exist without each other. Now the Mujaddidi Sufis, the successors of Sirhindi, were the most widespread Muslim network before the 20th century. Remarkably, they appear everywhere, at the helm of social and intellectual movements. Virtually 50% of all institutions of higher learning across the broader Persian-speaking Muslim world and beyond, literally Bosnia all the way to Indonesia and Xinjiang in China. And occasionally at the head of rebellions, as we discussed yesterday, from Istanbul to the Caucasus to Indonesia. In fact, virtually all of the major rebellions against against Russian and British rule, and in fact, Qing, Chinese rule, are led by Naqshbandi Mujaddidis in the 18th and 19th centuries. They had established a remarkable form of parallel popular leadership which transcended and outlived the ruling elites. They're still the most important network in places like Afghanistan and Indonesia, still very important in Turkey, yet most of us don't quite know why, especially the meeting point between theology and social movement. How do we draw this connection between Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's highly complex philosophical works and then this movement that basically appears in every corner of 70% of the Muslim world? My book, Hidden Caliphate, essentially argues that the Mujaddidis were synthesizers. They were translators. They brought together spaces and places and ideas that we would assume to be unconnected, fusing Persian, Arabic, and vernacular literary traditions, mystical virtuosity, popular religious practices, and the world of the urban ulema into a unified yet flexible articulation of Muslim orthodoxy. This particular flavor of orthodoxy gave coherence to diverse Muslim communities across a vast territory. And much of this has to do with Sirhindi's model of Sayr Suluk, in fact, the very path that human beings follow towards self-realization. But that will be, I think, beyond really the contours of this presentation. Now, before we begin, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to clarify some terms. Pir is the term that is used in Persian for sheikh, a Sufi sheikh or Sufi teacher. The term Khalifa is the appointed deputy of the Sufi master with permission to guide his or her own students, and those who saw my presentation yesterday will be aware that there were many women engaged in this enterprise, which is the subject of my next book. And the institutions that I'll talk about are the mosque, the madrasa for teaching outer sciences, whether law, mathematics, poetics, rhetoric, so on and so forth, from where students went on for higher studies to the Khanaqah, also called the Tekiye, the Zawiya, the Dargah, meaning the Sufi center for spiritual cleansing and the hidden sciences like dhikr and muraqabah, forms of meditation. Now, why is the story so important? Why should we care? Because it totally changes our conception of how the Muslim world works before colonialism and quote-unquote modernity in 5 key ways. First, it overturns a byproduct of the colonial imagination, the decline narrative. Hopefully we all know the decline narrative, the golden age, and then you've got a decline, right? The myth of social and intellectual breakdown within the Muslim world. Now, I of course focus on Central and Southern Asia, where it's often assumed, especially in the case of Afghanistan, that before colonialism, these regions were isolated backwaters. Everyone's with me? This is generally the assumption. Now, when we turn away from the colonial accounts and the court chronicles towards these Sufi networks, we see that despite political dissolution, this vast region remained culturally and intellectually integrated. In other words, political decline, or in fact this case just breakdown, does not necessarily mean cultural and intellectual decline. And the Mujaddidi Sufis, in fact, played a critical role in sustaining a zone of exchange through texts, through education, through pilgrimage, and universally trusted models of authority. They were seen, in say today's terms, as the honest brokers, who tied together the tribal, the urban, and the rural spaces, and seemingly unconnected social movements across the continent. Now, as a corollary to this, it also breaks down the equally problematic colonial geographic myth of Central versus Southern Asia versus Inner Asia and the Middle East. Hopefully I don't need to tell everyone here, these all are byproducts of Russian and British colonialism and the British Foreign Office and the State Department. And the moment that we bind ourselves within these particular lines, we actually fail to see the broader currents that are shifting across this particular zone. I argue that these are all interconnected, we should not see them separately. Now third, this is a very different story of Afghanistan, and I would extend that to modern-day Pakistan from what we are used to. Remarkably, the Afghan Empire was the pivot point for these trans-Asiatic networks, where a host of knowledge systems, spiritual and scholastic networks, and nationalities blended. This work is therefore essential in not only reframing our understanding of Afghanistan's history, but tracing how Afghanistan transformed from a cosmopolitan hub with a highly complex religious tradition into an isolated backwater by the late 20th century. This much, of course, is a story of colonialism. Now, fourth, this book shatters the myth of the orthodox ulama on one hand versus the heterodox Sufi, this sort of myth that these are two separate domains. This is also rooted entirely, as I'm sure all of you know, in 19th century Orientalist discourse. That these are two separate corporate groups, one is conservative, one is liberal, and they hate each other and they're constantly at loggerheads. Yes, you find these tropes within poetry, but these are tropes. Keep in mind, Hafiz was a Hafiz. Right? So he was a religious scholar, first and foremost. Before the 20th century, the Sufis, the teachers of meditation and the writers of love poetry, the scholarly class, the professors of literature, grammar, tafsir, astronomy, fiqh, etc., and the ecstatic mystics were actually all integrated, inseparable, and overlapping. Most figures you see at some stage in their life were all three. And certainly prior to the 20th century, in certainly the vast zone, Professor Wright, you can correct me on this, I'm assuming from Senegal to Indonesia, you had to have a dual affiliation with a particular school of jurisprudence and a school of tasawwuf. It was not a world of madrasas on one side and Sufi centers on another, and these kind of crazy wandering dervishes in another. The Mujaddidis and their contemporaries integrated all three, which made them such powerful agents of revival and connectivity. Every scholar was also a Sufi practitioner. Sufis had to abide by the Sharia. Jurists had to internally purify themselves. There's a logic to this. In fact, I mentioned this in the talk yesterday, that if you have studied law, you've studied jurisprudence, and you have a rotten core, you will probably end up being a blood-sucking lawyer, like most lawyers today. And if you're a Sufi and you do not circumscribe your own sort of unveilings and the things that you are experiencing within the contours of Sharia, or in fact one can extend this to just common human decency, you're probably going to become a cult leader, like many Sufis. All right, so this is the logic. Now finally, and most importantly, this book offers a very new understanding of sovereignty in the Muslim world. I'm hoping everyone here is familiar with this, but sometimes it just needs to be underlined. Of the practical relationship between the state, the subjects, and the religious space of mystics and scholars. So I argue that Muslims understood authority structures within a two-tiered paradigm, the Zahiri and the Batini, the manifest and the hidden. And again, this is in response to various models that you have the state sphere and the religious sphere, and the two work together, and various models that generally come out of a certain either Catholic or Protestant consciousness that are then translated into the Muslim context. And I'm recommending something a little bit different here. In this hierarchical model, which draws from the terms used by the scholars themselves, famously Shah Waliullah of the 18th century, many, many others. This hidden caliphate of Sufi scholastic networks maintains a trans-regional balance. It's like an umbrella, positioned over a manifest caliphate, the political authority made up of, in this case, in the 18th and 19th century, small fractured states. Although I would argue you can even extend this further back in time. The scholars Sufis provide a mix of social welfare services. Don't need to convince everyone here that a big part of what a Sufi center and a madrasa does is feed the poor. Social services and actually teach students the service ethos, cleaning bathrooms, for example, in its ideal form. They perform scholastic services, popular leadership. The madrasas and the Sufi centers provide ethical guidance and psychological counseling services. Beyond that, mediation, diplomacy, trade, even diplomatic services between warring states. They could even raise defensive irregular armies when required, often far more effective than the states themselves because of their reach. Or theologically challenge potentially dangerous ideologies that were threatening Islam from within. At the same time, state elites and subjects required this umbrella to sustain an interconnected world order. The urbanites, the pastoralists, tribals, the agriculturalists, the petty princes, the tribal chiefs, the landed gentry, alike relied on this overarching spiritual network for stability, communication, and mediation, both between competing parties and, of course, between the visible and the invisible realms. And this is the main thesis. Now, there are some things, in fact, I do in this book which are a little bit different. So rather than focusing on one figure, one place to understand how the Sufis function, I chose one Mujaddidi lineage, one silsila, and physically followed, in this case actually traveling, the careers of members of the lineage across generations and across South and Central Asia and the steppes. The lineage I chose was that of a fascinating 18th century Mujaddidi scholar, Sufi, Fazl Ahmad of Peshawar. Now a border town in Peshawar, back then a bustling capital and metropolis of the Afghan Empire alongside Kabul. So Peshawar and Kabul, hopefully you can see them on the map, amongst all of this clutter, were the two capitals of the Afghan Empire. Now what drew me to Fazl Ahmad was that he is completely forgotten today. Yet he and his descendants end up being connected to almost every major Muslim social movement from India to Siberia, literally within half a degree of separation, attracting followers from ascetics and celebrated scholars to Afghan kings and at least 5 rulers of Central Asia. So the book ended up being structured like a transgenerational travel account of Fazl Ahmad and his students, which somewhat mirrored my own voyage, starting from Sirhind in North India. It's a little bit, look, it's on the map here, you can see it over there between Lahore and Delhi, to which has the shrine of Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi and an academic, very major academic complex, to Peshawar in Pakistan, to Kabul in Afghanistan, to Mazar-e Sharif in northern Afghanistan. You can see it a little bit south of the Uzbek border, above this, the label of Tashurban. To Bukhara, into Tataristan and the steppes, to Farghana and Xinjiang in China. And finally to the pastoral nomadic caravan routes, ending in the ungovernable Afghan tribal regions. So the story actually ends in a place called North Waziristan. Has anyone ever heard of North Waziristan?
Yes.
You have. In what context?
I mean, in the recent context, like bombing and everything.
Bombing and everything, right? Obama called it the most dangerous place in the world, rather problematically. Actually, the last phase of this network takes place in North Waziristan, which is where I'm working these days. It's right on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, half the fun has been the journey itself, I'm not going to lie, encountering an array of sources from the built environment, oral histories, biographies, cosmological text, meditation handbooks, polemics in Persian, Arabic, Chagatai, Uyghur, Tatar, Urdu, Pashto, and determining how to approach each as historical sources. Now, because of the varied sources in each region and each location, and because of the fact that many of these locations have not been looked into, this ends up actually working in my favor, because every chapter ends up telling a very different story based on the sources, revealing a new dimension of how the network functioned and how the Sufis were able to penetrate into such very sacred landscapes. Now with that, I'm going to walk you through the remarkable story of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, the protagonist of my book. Now the key take-homes of this very complicated story, do not get lost in the names and the places, is connectivity amidst political fracturing, incredible intellectual exchange, and insights into the rich, multifaceted world, multicultural world of the 18th, 19th century Sufi scholar. I'm going to inundate you with details, I'm letting you know this in advance, so we can get a real sense, a tangible sense of how these networks functioned and flourished. So bear with me as we go on this journey. Now Fazl Ahmad, born in 1743 into Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's family. Now he's the founder, or I should say the focal point of the Mujaddidi Sufi tradition. So Fazl Ahmad was a product of the academically and spiritually active world of late Mughal Sirhind, which was actually called Dar-ul-Irshad. It was a cosmopolitan town on the Lahore-Delhi highway. Sirhind hosted the shrine of Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi and an academic complex which for generations was the focal point of Sufis and scholars. Some of the greatest exegetes in the world would show up there, who produced a large body of literature synthesizing pedagogies of multiple intellectual traditions, whether meditative or breathing sciences, channeling energy through points of the body, or fiqh, hadith, and tafsir. Now for 24 years, 1767, we are told, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad studied the revealed and the rational sciences and received intensive training in Sufi practices. He attained teaching diplomas, several of them, and then taught for several years at the Sufi Center in Sirhind. Then, in the wake of invasions and civil war that rocked North India in the mid-18th century, the Mujaddidi Sufis and their disciples fled Sirhind. Many were welcomed in the newly forming Afghan Empire. Fazl Ahmad in the late 1760s migrated to Peshawar and established himself at a humble mosque where we are told that he earned a reputation initially by supplying a vast quantity of free bread to the people during a harsh drought. His circle of disciples grew exponentially, and eventually he set up an independent Sufi center and madrasa in a neighborhood which came to be known by his son's name, Fazl Haq, and in fact which is still known by his son's name. Soon after, Fazl Ahmad embarked upon the first of 5 journeys to Bukhara via Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, establishing Sufi communities en route. In Bukhara, he established a major Sufi center where the celebrated state builder of Bukhara, the king Shah Murad, and his son and successor, and numerous scholars and nobility became his devoted disciples. So this really complex map is from contemporary sources, which actually tell us that his disciples numbered in the thousands on both sides of the Oxus River, and he appointed 600 at least khulafa, or deputies, of whom I found about 118 names now in contemporary biographies, and I'm still finding more and more. Deputies included some of the leading scholars, Quranic exegetes, mystical poets, specialists on Rumi's Masnavi, to Majnun ecstatic mystics who controlled jinns, from Erzurum in the Ottoman Empire to Dagestan in Russia, Osh in Kyrgyzstan, to Punjab in Pakistan. Now what you see here is Fazl Ahmad's travel route, and all of the regions listed here are areas with either Sufi centers, appointed deputies, or a concentration of disciples. I want you to think for a while about even today, the geographic and ethnic and cultural and linguistic diversity in these regions, and then put yourself about 240, 250 years ago, and imagine what it's like to actually integrate these regions and set up functional institutions. The Mujaddidis were master institution builders. So some khulafa were appointed to teach at their places of origin, but several from South Asia and the Afghan Empire were appointed in Central Asia as chief cities. And I'll give you an example of a khalifa from, it's actually a major college town in Punjab, with major madrasas back in the 17th century. Now this khalifa within several years of his arrival in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan now, became the revered Samarkandi, waliullah and scholar, and was called Lal Beg Samarkandi. Most of the stories follow this pattern. The principal Sufi centers were at Bukhara, at Peshawar, and Aqcha, which is near the Afghan-Uzbek border, in addition to many others established by disciples, which then become hubs for further sub-networks. So his son, for example, at Bukhara, appointed deputies at Tashkent, Tatarstan, and Siberia, including some of the greatest scholars, actually, of the late 18th and early 19th century, Tatar scholars. Similarly, another disciple, Imam Raza, appointed Khulafa across today's Pakistan-Afghanistan tribal border. Now, as an example of how these networks and institutions were constructed, let's consider this figure, Imam Raza. It's a bit of an extreme version of the story, but it should give you a sense of how this works. Now, he belonged to a locally venerated tribe-based saintly family tied to the Miakhil Afghan tribe of Govindas. Now, what does this mean? Basically, there are essentially sedentary and nomadic Afghan tribes that migrate twice a year between Central Asia and the Indus River, along with their flock. And they settle down briefly between the migrations to do agriculture. This is a remarkably different environment as compared to urban centers like Bukhara or Delhi or Istanbul or Cairo, right? You can well imagine. We're talking about a peripatetic world. Now, for once, while Fazl Ahmad's urban disciples were often accomplished scholars, Imam Raza grew up a goat herd and was illiterate. His world was one of fantastical miracles that were intimately interwoven with the perils and the opportunities of the caravan journey and its natural environment. In fact, one of the major instances of his life, the spiritual openings that he has, is when he actually risks his life to save some puppies who are starving. Now, when Imam Raza becomes Fazl Ahmad's Khalifa, there emerges a synergetic relationship. So Imam Raza brought to the table the respect of his family among the nomadic tribes. They knew how the tribes worked, the day-to-day economic and political and spiritual operations, and of course all of their sacred spaces across the caravan routes, while Fazl Ahmad called what we may call today institutional capacity, and links to the trans-Asiatic Sufi and madrasa networks and their textual traditions. Now, within one generation, we find Imam Raza's sons composing sophisticated theological and juristic tracts, which cite over 100 classical works, presumably all of these works housed at the center in a little village along the nomadic trade routes. These were the institutions where the urban domain met the pastoral nomadic. It's a very important aspect of the way, in fact, institutional Islam spreads that we often leave out. Not everything happens in cities. Now, other Khulafa belong to older established Sufi lineages, whether in Central Asia or the Mughal Empire. Fazl Ahmad's principal biography was written by a Khalifa at Mazar-e-Sharif, who was in fact the brother of the custodian of Mazar-e-Sharif, the shrine city in northern Afghanistan. And for those of you who may not know, this is where Imam Ali is believed to be buried alongside Najaf. There are two alternative narratives. In fact, more than two, but these are the two big ones. It's a very interesting story. This is one of the most important academic centers in Central Asia. And in fact, who you're seeing here is Shan Atiq, who's in fact descendant of the Ansari family who wrote the biography. Who also buried the Sahiba, again, for those who were in the talk yesterday. These people, in fact, in the 18th century were governors of the most important shrine state and sacred nucleus of Central Asia. Now, as a prelude to discussing Fazl Ahmad's career in Peshawar and Bukhara, I wanted to provide a glimpse into a vast topic. And I apologize for the small writing, but just bear with me. His teachings following Sirkindi stress the interdependence of Tasawwuf and Sharia, the manifest and the hidden, as a means to attain spiritual growth and live according to the prophetic example. His disciples have left us with detailed first-hand accounts of his life that reflect this ethos. He led a highly disciplined life, both ascetic and practical, teaching meditation and revealing rational sciences, pursuing his own spiritual practices, and then managing day-to-day affairs of the community. For example, you can see he taught Hadith and Fiqh, the collected letters of Sheikh Ahmad Sahindi, and there are certain moments where different forms of meditative practices are performed and taught. He slept only 4 hours a day. In fact, most people going through these processes were able to change their sleep patterns in ways that just allowed for really more productivity during the day. Now, it's important to note that his most reproduced work is just a 10-page handbook. I found about 15 to 20 copies across Tashkent and Polkand and Xinjiang, all the way to throughout Afghanistan and up to Lahore. And it's really a teacher's manual summarizing some points on Sufi practice. What's remarkable here is the practical way in which he presents Sufi knowledge, again, bound within the scripture, to explain to students what they should expect on the Mujaddidi Sufi path and the core practices of the curriculum. For example, taking initiation, how to energize your lataif, which to attain spiritual states, and these are subtle metaphysical points mapped onto the human body, which are, you can say, energized with certain meditative techniques to allow for spiritual travel and growth. It's a science that Al-Ghazali writes about, and so on and so forth. And a comparative analysis on the benefits of channeling the breath and meditation within 3 Sufi orders, so it's also a comparative manual. And it's a fascinating text because it gives us a sense of the degree to which spiritual practices have become an empirical science. The practices he lays out are so systematic that he points out by the 3rd guided 40-day meditation session, a good student should reach this state of Fana al-Qalb, the annihilation of the heart. In summary, the teachings that he and the other Mujaddidis carried from South and Central Asia onward reflect a philosophy in which energizing subtle centers of the body, metaphysical body, coexist with jurisprudence and scriptural study. This is really orthodoxy. In fact, everyone from the Ottoman emperors to really the shuyukh of Xinjiang are actually performing these practices. Now let's turn to Peshawar. To explore how its distinctive position during the rise of the Afghan Empire, now this is about 1750 to about 1800, all right? Everyone with me in terms of the dates? Try to draw parallels in perhaps geographic worlds that you're more familiar with. Now, how it allowed this region to host a religious academic infrastructure where ideas could develop and travel onwards into China, Russia, and Central Asia. Now, given that Peshawar was an important Mughal commercial town, the Mujaddidi order was established there soon after its emergence in Sirhind, so really by about 1650, about 100 years before Fazl Ahmad is born. Now, particularly from the Afghan occupation in 1750 and onwards, the Peshawar Valley greatly benefited because you've got this turmoil in Mughal India toward the east, and then waves of scholars are basically traveling westward because these are now the cities of opportunity. And they settled in both urban and tribal areas around Peshawar city, which is highly arable land. So it's excellent sort of, when the waqfs are issued, this is phenomenal land to then basically support the underlying institutions. When in the 1770s, Kabul and Peshawar become the dual capitals of the Afghan Empire, the sister cities profit from a rejuvenated north-south trade, and land grants to Sufis and ulema increase considerably. And a lot of people don't realize this, but in the 18th century, the north-south trade was dominated by horses. Horses obviously are the automobile and the airplane of the past. This trade is several times greater than the overland trade. So these cities there's actually a whole trade circuit that basically goes from St. Petersburg in Russia all the way down into South Asia, and cities like Peshawar and Kabul are in the center of this. So we're talking about now some of the richest cities in the world. Now, the result was a closely knit web of Sufi orders and madrasas whose disciples set up madrasas and Sufi centers providing education and social services, where a range of philosophies and pedagogies coalesced, ready for onward travel into Inner Asia's open markets. Now, I've put together here, it's a small version, it's a cross-section of some of the principal Mujaddidi lineages in Peshawar. Scholars who know the region are going to recognize a lot of these names as very famous scholars, mystics, anti-colonial revolutionaries, activists. And this is simply to give you a sense of how this intellectual spiritual world was intimately connected. And again, this may not be particularly relevant for those who don't know the region. These are the lineage of the Hazarat of Shur Bazar, who actually, up till the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, were
probably the most important Sufi lineage of Afghanistan. In fact, were leading a lot of the Afghan jihad in the 1980s. One member of the family became the president of Afghanistan in the 90s. We've got here two fascinating figures. Professor Wright, this is for you. Ehsan Daraz and Azim, who actually lead the theological response to Sayyid Ahmad al-Raibari. These are the key figures. In fact, their letters to him and the responses back on the letters are actually written on Sayyid Ahmad's gravestone to prove that his aqidah is correct. And you've got figures like Ahmad al-Swat, who is one of the most sort of interesting and for the colonial mind, mysterious figures, who actually is a scholar in the highlands, the Afghan highlands in Swat in northern Pakistan, and who ends up actually more or less being asked to set up a state at the time when British colonialism was sort of working its way westward. And he is a very famous anti-colonial activist who is known for his chivalry. Now, the Mujaddidi Sufis also play critical roles in providing coherence to a region where governance is highly decentralized. Now, I gave you some examples of anti-colonial activism, and I'm going to give you a very different example right now, just in a moment. Now, a well-known archaeologist and adventurer, Charles Mason, mentions that in his notes that caravans through the Khyber Pass would be accompanied by Sufis who, respected by tribal authorities, could negotiate safe passage in tolls. In fact, he points out that certain trade routes could only be traversed by Sufi pirs. Another major European administrator talks about the Sindhi pirs, the Mujaddidi pirs, and their role in trade. Now, Fazl Ahmad managed a vigorous trade network. The leads from Peshawar to Bukhara provided him with land grants and mills, which, along with his trade, financed the center. So it's very important that all of these institutions need a financial base, and these financial bases were very strong. They knew how to move capital very fast. In fact, the funny thing is you often had even warring states who were providing for the same silsilas, which often happened in Fazl Ahmad's case, because all recognized that they required their services to keep the global order intact. Now, a network of individuals, including his sons, disciples, and even a Hindu merchant from the Asian banking capital of Shikarpur, were designated as his intermediaries. Indeed, when here's the episode I was talking about, when two of the most famous European agents and explorers, I should say infamous, William Moorcroft and Alexander Burns, required safe passage to Central Asia, they were referred to Fazl Ahmad's son Fazl-e-Haq on account of the fact that the rulers of 5 Central Asian kingdoms were his disciples. Now, the William Moorcroft episode is a remarkable example of the mechanics of the Mujaddidi networks and its transactional economy. In the 1820s, Moorcroft, ostensibly in search of horses for the British East India Company, needed access to Bukhara in Central Asia. His secretary, Mir Izzatullah, himself a Mujaddidi, and in fact a very, very remarkable scholar himself, suggested that he approach a certain Shah Niaz. I'm going to draw a map out here for you. Shah Niaz was an originally Tashkendi, Tashkent being up here, Sufi who, in fact, from a royal family of Tashkent, later Kashmiri down here, who then ends up moving to Buddhist Ladakh in the mountains. And as it happens, Shah Niaz had lost his Kashmiri properties after the Sikh occupation of Kashmir, and he became somewhat of a confidant to the Buddhist ruler of Ladakh. So here is an Orthodox scholar who is becoming the confidant and kind of number 2 to the Buddhist ruler of Ladakh. At Ladakh, Shah Niaz graciously offered to refer Moorcroft to Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar, who he said would be able to facilitate his journey to Bukhara. Now, Moorcroft, in turn, offered to convince the Sikh ruler, with whom he had good relations, to return Shah Niaz's lands in Kashmir. See all the webs here. Which eventually happened. Now, Moorcroft then goes off to Peshawar, so from Ladakh goes off to Peshawar and then moves up towards Central Asia. And in fact, when he gets to Peshawar, he basically agrees he talks to Fazl Ahmad's son, and Fazl Ahmad offers to finance his journey and says, "Can you please give me good references to the kings along the way?" So Fazl Ahmad's son says, "It seems it seems decent, you seem like a trader, and it's something that should be a mutually beneficial arrangement. Now, however, due to some mischief in this communication, Moorcroft ends up being detained by the sort of famously obstinate ruler of a state called Qunduz. And you see the Badakhshan over there in the center, so it's a little bit to the left of Badakhshan. Now, eventually, through Fazl Ahmad's network, he was referred to a Mujaddidi Sufi of Qunduz, who had local clout with the king of Qunduz, in fact was his father-in-law, and managed to negotiate his release. And here are the release papers. This is a startling example of how the Sufis held together the fabric of society. Now, such diplomatic services went far beyond assisting merchants, and the shrines and Sufi centers in this network often became safe houses and neutral spaces for political negotiation. And I've got many examples in my book that if you've got, let's say, two warring principalities, and there happens to be a moment where, let's say, no truce has come to, the war is still continuing, two or three princes on opposing sides may actually take refuge in a Sufi center, the war actually stops. The moment the sheikh, and it still happens in one Waziristan, in fact, friends of mine who I work with, who are scholars there, will enter into a battlefield wearing white clothing, and that will be the end of the war. The two parties basically stop the war, and then it creates basically a space for truce. Now, this neutrality is enshrined within the Mujahideen's own written tradition. One rarely finds a critique of other religious denominations. To provide, although of course they are very strict on matters of orthodoxy. Now, to provide an example, one of Fazl Ahmad's trusted deputies has left us in a manuscript form his recollections of his time with Fazl Ahmad. In one instance, he was dispatched. Now, his disciple was dispatched to meet the Shia governor of Peshawar to resolve a minor dispute. Now, as it happens, the meeting didn't go well, and the discussion generated into verbal abuses. And those who know Persian, it went from Shuma to Tum. So, all right. So the Khalifa left, related the episode to Fazl Ahmad, adding that as it was expected, this was expected because the governor was, after all, a Shia and a heretic. Now, Fazl Ahmad was visibly upset, and he responded by reminding this deputy that Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi addressed his letters respectfully to Hindus. So who are you to declare a Shia who fulfills the religious obligations from the Sunnah to be a heretic, return to see the governor tomorrow? So feeling a little bit sheepish, this deputy returns to the governor, and as it happens, both profusely apologize to each other, and apparently the dispute was resolved with ease. So indeed, it's this combination of educational, economic, and diplomatic services that allows the Mujaddidi Sufis such easy entry across Asia. And I'm now going to turn to Bukhara, which, like Peshawar, offers ample opportunities for scholars and Sufis under the patronage of the Uzbek Khans. These are the kings. This is an unbelievable case study. It's about 2.5 chapters in my book, because here we find kings who are not just supporters of the Sufis and the scholars, but trained to become licensed scholars and Sufi masters and teachers of meditation themselves. Now, Bukhara, as you probably know, had a reputation of being the college town par excellence. By the 18th century, however, you had environmental crisis, and the academies had obviously been wrecked by the early 18th century. And then the Iranian soldier of fortune who I mentioned right at the beginning, Nadir Shah, comes in through the 1740s and totally upsets the social order. But then after his death, 1747, again, about 1750, an Uzbek family comes to power and begins to reconsolidate Bukhara and repopulate the city, which meant bringing in the Mujaddidis who could power up the academic and spiritual scene. Now, at this time, Bukhara Sufis received considerable patronage. They were given stipends to travel through the now very rich trade routes to study with Mujaddidi Sufis in the Afghan Empire, often returning home after getting their diplomas. In addition, we have several Afghan Sufis and scholars who then establish colleges in Bukhara, and some of them, like in the case of Fazl Ahmad, there's a very major college that's actually been abandoned for several generations that's then given over to him to resuscitate. Now, this diagram you're seeing before you, and I realize you may not know the names here, but it shows as in Peshawar, we have an interlocking network of Mujaddidi scholars and Sufis comprised of recent immigrants from the Afghan Empire, as well as members of old Sufi scholarly lineages who are now inducted into the Mujaddidi order under the Sufi masters of the Afghan Empire. And most often their institutions are basically given it's almost a resurgence in the Manqulat Naqulat, in the revealed and rational sciences and in teaching apparatus, and then in more systematic Sufi teachings. Now in this environment, it is in this environment that Fazl Ahmad arrives in Bukhara in the 1770s, and he's, as I said, granted one of the city's most important madrasas, the Mira Khan, from which he attracted scores of disciples. And it's here that he meets the young king, Shah Murad. Now, even before meeting Fazl Ahmad, Shah Murad had expressed a deep commitment to tasawwuf and scholarship. We are told he sought only the company of Sufis and scholars, abandoned all the trappings of royalty, and actually even engaged in manual labor. He even famously refused to accept kingship until pressured by the community, so the chronicles tell us, to assume the position and rectify the ills of the past. Now, 2 years after his coronation, in about 1787-1788, Shah Murad was initiated by Fazl Ahmad into the Mujaddidi Sufi path. We are told that Shah Murad would attend Fazl Ahmad's sessions every morning and evening, spending several hours in the Sufi center. Eventually, the young king, we are told, excelled in spiritual exercises with superb spiritual concentration, to the extent that he and later his sons were actually appointed amongst Fazl Ahmad's khulafa, with permission, and I have actually the certificate, to guide their own students on the Sufi path. This is actually evidenced with this phenomenal correspondence. It's over 100 letters that the Sufi sheikh writes to the king in response to his letters. And it gives you a very sort of kind of day-to-day practical insights into what this relationship looked like. So there's a chapter of my book dedicated to this, and I found the source to be quite eye-opening. In fact, in many of these letters, the Sufi guide actually reprimands the king for being lax in his practices. So you actually see that there is a power hierarchy between the teacher and the sheikh. And it's also rather fascinating that in questions of fiqh, he will tell him to go to his deputy, who happens to be, let's say, a scholar of jurisprudence, because each of the scholars within the network have their own requisite specialization. Now, it's under the influence of Fazl Ahmad and his contemporaries that a new ethos of governance emerges in Bukhara, and this is where the story gets interesting, as Shah Murad actively endeavors to bring the Mujaddidi ethic into his rule. At a personal level, Shah Murad retains the habit of a darwish, reserving only 4 dirhams a day for his family expenses while composing treatises on tafsir. At the same time, he initiated judicial, fiscal, and legal reforms to reduce tax burdens and curb corruption. Perhaps most significant, he patronized education to such a degree that by the end of his reign, Bukhara was transformed into a major seat of learning, with 80 madrasas by the early 19th century and over 30,000 students, as per the chronicles, supported by the state. Their academic budget is probably higher than their military budget. I wish others could do that, at least for the sake of us academics. As Bukhara's madrasa and Sufi center infrastructure rapidly develops, the Afghan state began providing stipends for students to study in Bukhara. By 1808, we have an extensive exchange, an academic exchange between Peshawar and Bukhara, and Fazl Ahmad's institutions are part of this exchange. From Shah Murad's reign onwards, a new model of kingship emerges, synthesizing the old Mongol and the Persian models with a Mujaddidi ethical consciousness. Later chronicles often begin entries on the reign of Shah Murad with the prophetic tradition of Tajdid, that every 100 years a Mujaddid or reviver will appear to renew the religion. Shah Murad is actually explicitly referred to in his biographies as the Mujaddid of the century. These chronicles present the time before him as a period of decline and disorder, in which a young prince meets a darwish, assumes the throne exactly, by the way, the year 1200, which maps onto the 100-year renewal cycles, and revives the Sunnah. The ideal king is still the Perso-Turkic empire builder, administrator, and soldier par excellence, who's doing his campaigns every single year. But to this is added the humble ascetic scholar who walks with his head down in the streets, according to Sunnah, the accessible supporter of the masses, the patron of the khanaqahs and the madrasas, and the Sufi, the dust of whose grave may have miraculous healing qualities, as the chronicles continue. Now, with patronage from both the Oxus and the Indus, Fazl Ahmad's order rapidly spread across Asia, and his last trip to Bukhara was in 1814, and he passed away 2 years later in 1816. Now, his successors highlight the degree to which Sufi lineages like Fazl Ahmad's, and it's one of in fact several thousand, assimilated the regions on both sides of the Oxus and the Indus. There's a well-known Indian traveler and diplomat, Mohan Lal Kashmiri, who describes Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar as the saint of all Peshawar and Turkestan. Incidentally, by the way, the same son actually leads tribal forces against an invading Sikh army in a very famous battle, one of the most famous battles of the Peshawar Valley, the Battle of Nowshera. Now, Fazl Ahmad's son and successor in Bukhara was a teacher of the great Tatar scholar Shahabuddin Marjani in Russia. For those who may be aware, he is probably the most famous Tatar scholar of the age, who praises Fazl Ahmad's son in his writings and says that half of Bukhara came to his funeral. Fazl Ahmad's grandson actually becomes the Vish Imam of the Jami Mosque, the Cathedral Mosque of Bukhara as well. Several great Siberian shuyukh were his khulafa. Sheikhs who pondered over such questions as to whether the evening prayers could be skipped in the event of 3 hours of daylight. True story. This is actually a question that was raised. But you actually have an academic resurgence in the late 18th and 19th century across Siberia, and a lot of it ends up being connected to, well, most of it, to two Mujaddidi orders based in Kabul and Peshawar. Now, Fazl Ahmad's son in Kokand, and this is today's Farghana, it's this great state that was emerging between Russia and China and Bukhara in South Asia. In fact, it was on its way to becoming a major world power in the 18th century. His son was almost like a patron scholar Sufi of the Khanate. His disciple was Muqimi, who is one of the greatest poets of Chagatai Turkish language. In fact, today, if you go to his Fazl Ahmad's son's mother's it's a museum now dedicated to the poet Muqimi, those who may know the history of Turkish. Another family member was a famous ambassador to St. Petersburg, who actually had a famous 4-hour-long negotiation with Tsar Nicholas on behalf of the state of Kokand. One of the largest madrasas in Xinjiang, in China, until the 1970s, Chang Madrasa was also part of Fazl Ahmad's lineage via Kyrgyzstan. Now, surprisingly, the last of Fazl Ahmad's great descendants in the latter 20th century was a great scholar of North Waziristan, as I said, now was dubbed by Obama problematically as the most dangerous place in the world. And he was the spiritual guide of the tribal belt that through all the brutal Afghan wars, through the Soviet Afghan War and then further on. He even ran two publishing houses with books on Sunni doctrine, metaphysics, philosophy, poetry, and meditation in 4 languages, many of which he wrote himself. And I have actually received, this is his Sufi center in the highland areas. This is also near the Afghan-Pakistan border. And I have actually, for the last year and a half, been working, I received a grant, and I'm archiving all of his letters, his poetry, his maktubat, his publications, and other manuscripts, and in fact, his manuscript library, compiling them, and they're actually scattered across various villages, along with his successors and, in fact, the scholars who succeeded him. He had 80 khulafa on both sides of the tribal belt in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and if any of you know the area, you know that it's a feat to actually manage a network like that from 1950 to 2000 to the mid-2000s. So what we're basically doing is we are, in fact, working to digitize and catalog all of the materials, and this actually has the capacity to provide a completely new narrative of a region that's only been represented through a security lens for the past 150 years. There are actually, I would argue, no studies of North Waziristan that don't come from the colonial gaze, which gives you a completely separate narrative of actually what's happening there and the rich scholastic and spiritual environment that these tribal areas that we treat as these kind of hotbeds of extremism and idiocy are actually producing. Now, but this gives you a sense, by the way, of the fact that Fazl Ahmad's order is still very much alive in this supposedly ungovernable tribal belt in the 21st century. Now, I'm going to finish off with this image of a genealogical chart at Fazl Ahmad's shrine in today's Peshawar. And this chart gives you a sense of how all the branches of the Mujaddidi lineage are interconnected in the Silsila's consciousness even today. And again, those who work in this part of the world are actually going to recognize some of the most famous madrasas in South and Central Asia on this chart. In fact, correction, in South Asia in this chart. Now, what you see here is basically a chart that covers Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And so we've got Fazl Ahmad, we've got the most famous Sufi center in Delhi here, which was then one of the first sites that ended up being destroyed in 1857. In fact, they had issued one of the first fatwas of jihad for the Great Rebellion. And you have several Afghan lineages. This is Mirza Mazhar Jinnah, is one of the greatest poets of the Urdu language and Persian of the 18th century, so on and so forth. What's fascinating about this chart is there's no Central Asia. It's missing. And the breaking of these historical chains is actually what I end up discussing in my book. How this happened, when this happened, why this happened. And this, of course, I will not be able to get into in the course of the presentation, but I hope that this gives you a sense of, at least, of some of the many ways in which these Sufi scholarly networks function. So in summary, what you have is a vast zone of exchange, highly complex intellectual and spiritual discourse, reaching well into the tribal and highland areas, a zone mediated by Sufis who incorporated both the outer and the inner sciences, the spiritual and practical knowledge systems, a thread that brought together the world on both sides of the Oxus and the Indus rivers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ziad. So, as I said at the outset, so what we'll have now is that we will have room open for some questions. But first, we'll have a brief discussion, some questions posed by Dr. Zachary Wright, the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs at
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ziad. It's an honor to have you here and to see your work flourishing. Congratulations on all of the prestigious awards that this book has received. I just want to ask you a question right off the bat to kind of maybe launch into a larger point. So you have made the point that the chains have been under pressure, perhaps not entirely broken. So I'm aware, of course, that the Mujahideen lineages are still active in many places of Turkey, the Levant, Egypt, into America. Are there any estimates about the numbers of people that continue to affiliate themselves with the Mujahideen network today?
Numbers are difficult, right? Because in any Sufi order, you have different levels of affiliation. So you're going to have those who consider themselves to be, in fact, there are two really different levels going on here. Those who consider themselves to be disciples on the path formal, and of course, broader community members that may be associated with a local network that actually provides them with local succor, or in fact, even often a place to eat. And then you have those who are, let's say, from different silsilas who follow Sheikh Ahmed Siddi's teachings because they end up providing such a robust framework in which to understand the interrelationship between Tasawwuf and Sharia.
Spoken like an academic.
Spoken like an academic, right? Do you want a number? All right, I'll give you a number. All right. All right, so last time I was in Kabul, there were 51 functional Sufi centers in Kabul, and about at least half of them were Mujahideen. The Mujahideen orders tend to not have large fairs, and the activities that lend themselves to let's say ecstatic forms of worship, or to let's say improper behavior, So their communities often tend to be small. Okay, I'm not going to give you a number here because I don't want to tie myself down and then be quoted later on for this. But by virtue of the fact that the Mujaddidis were able to mobilize across the tribal and the highland regions, across the Tajik regions and Pakhtun regions in Afghanistan in the 1980s, to give you a sense of their, so you can do the math there, and then when one is actually, when I'm, for example, doing work with the Mujaddidis, we're going to find communities virtually in every locale, from Kandahar to Mazar into, let's say, Sindh and Rajasthan, who will be connected to this also.
Yeah, good. I mean, the point that I want to sort of push on here is that a lot of this sounds like new knowledge to many of us. We're talking about Lataif and Insan, the kind of subtle presences of the human being. We're also talking about very complex tribal configurations in which Sufis have inserted themselves as intermediaries. But the bigger picture here should not be lost, which is essentially that we're talking about very, very important, as you described them, one of the most widespread networks in Asia. I think if we look at the Mujahideen network in combination with other Sufi lineages that are still active in today's world, like the Shazaliya or the Tijaniya in Africa, I mean, we are really talking, the Tijaniya puts its internal membership at around 100 million. Again, difficult, I can answer that as an academic also, but it's interesting to sort of think about the broad resonance and importance of these movements that have really escaped our attention as academics. And I would even say, especially in the Arab world, these are sort of seen as peripheral movements. We need to kind of retake the center back and sort of recognize that, yes, everybody's been talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, they've been talking about the Wahhabiyya. These are movements that dwarf them in scope, in depth, and reach in today's world. And yet, because they're not led by Arabs with the right dress or whatever the case may be, or they don't factor into CNN, they don't fit the image of the CNN Muslim, that they're often escaping our attention, both in popular discourses and in academic research. So I really thank you for recentering us on this very, very important network. So I'm just going to give a couple of...
That's right, did you quickly respond
Yeah,
to
of course.
that? I really appreciate that very much, and obviously I really appreciate the fact that you're sitting here next to me right now. Much of this has to do, actually, much of the critique and not understanding the world of the Sufis and the scholars comes from the colonial critique. Because in the 19th century, which unfortunately most of us, and I'm going to put myself in the same box, have actually internalized. So, because I am not right now doing my meditations on the subtle centers, and neither am I enrolled in a madrasa. The issue is that as the 19th century was wearing on, knowledge systems that were not connected to military production, warfare, and industrial production were deemed to be unnecessary. And they were deemed to be vestiges of the past. There are a sequence of critiques that basically come up throughout the course of the 19th century that are driven, in fact, French colonialism, Russian colonialism, British colonialism, that these institutions have no production. Which is, of course, ironic because all of your great institutions in the West all begin as, in fact, seminaries, and the liberal arts, in fact, system actually is rooted in very much the same thing, that you need to develop a core before you get into, let's say, building machines. So what ends up happening is, especially when in the tail end of the 19th century, there's a complete kind of denial of the spiritual human self in London, in Paris, elsewhere, that somehow, Paris less so actually, but certainly in Manchester and Liverpool and all the places that are producing the Industrial Revolution, that we end up basically start treating our own institutions as lesser institutions that are somehow a vestige of a useless past. And bit by bit, what you end up having is the Hanukkahs are actually, the Sufi centers are directly attacked quite often in Russia, in the Russian Empire and the British Empire, because they are a physical threat, because of their ability to mobilize. So they come under physical threat, and then the Waqf system is broken, and the Madrasa Waqf system are broken, and then that critique basically we internalize it. If I have a child and I want the child to succeed, I will not send them to a madrasa, and I surely will not send them to meditate and basically cleanse their inner self and become really more balanced human beings. I'm going to send them to a shrink, eventually, when they break down after using their cell phones enough. And I will send them to if I want them to study law, I'm going to send them to a legal institution that is based in either, let's say, some British legal system or American legal system, and so on and so forth, right? So it's this overall critique that, unfortunately, even when we make it at an academic level, our very lives don't align with that reality. The mere fact that I am not spending all of that time doing supererogatory prayers at night basically indicates that somehow I still don't quite think it's important, and the fly-by-night shrink, the therapist down the road, who's combining different knowledge systems, somehow has a better sense of how my mind and my spirit functions.
All right, thank you. You preempted one of my comments. I think that Professor Waleed Ziad's in Caliphate really helps us to reinterrogate this long 19th century in the Muslim world, roughly from 1750 perhaps to the early 20th century, a period which has been variously scapegoated by later reformists as a time of stagnation, superstition, and fanaticism. Ziad gives voice to a vibrant religious network with very real social, economic, and political influence that responded from within the Islamic tradition and from the wider culture of the Persian cosmopolis. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, okay. To a time of immense, responding to a time of immense political turmoil in the disintegrating Timurid dynasty in Hind and the Safavid collapse in Persia. In other words, Muslims were perfectly capable of responding to periods of uncertainty and deteriorating political sovereignty without resorting to frameworks imported by the West. This was a lesson that was somehow lost on later generations of Muslim reformers. So I think in particular, your book really raises very interesting questions about the nature of sovereignty as we're defining it in the Muslim world. And you engage with this question of the Islamic secular, I think, in interesting ways. You also make very important points, I think, about sort of predating formalized Islamic knowledge, Islamic knowledge curriculum in non-urban areas, something that we've been accustomed to sort of think about, at least from the literature, from the way I'm reading it, in the Indian subcontinent context, to be thinking about it as primarily the impetus of the Deobandi network, largely in response to British colonialism. You seem to sort of predate that quite a bit. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions and then open it up for larger questions from the audience. One, I need to give a little bit of background, and I want to ask you more specifically about how you deal theoretically with the concept of the Muslim scholar among Mujaddidi lineages. In other words, what are we missing from our modern privileging of exoteric knowledge and understanding the scholarly authority of Mujaddidi scholars? So for example, in my own work in 18th century North and West Africa, I make the point that Sufism is most closely in dialogue with the broader Islamic sciences. We can read it largely through pedagogical techniques, namely personalized knowledge transmission, I think encapsulated by the famous statement of Ibn Jumah, the Syrian sheikh in the 14th century, said the greatest calamity is to take knowledge from books instead of sheikhs. And notions of internalized knowledge. And for me, this is kind of best approximated in Western discourse by Bourdieu's notion of the artist, who internalizes a certain expertise within a field of knowledge and reproduces it extemporaneously in new circumstances. Very similar to a jazz musician who might have learned the chords of the laws of producing music, but then produces new riffs in new circumstances. I think many of us have seen Muslim scholars in action. It's a very interesting corollary. At the same time, scholars appear to recognize different epistemologies all working at the same time, kind of similar drawing of Al-Ghazali, where knowledge by transmission could be used in hadith and fiqh sciences, knowledge by rational deduction could also be used in fiqh sciences and theology, and spiritual unveiling through self-purification was obviously something that applied to Sufism. So at the same time, you're recognizing all of these different epistemologies operating simultaneously you're sort of pervaded by a notion of internalized knowledge and its importance of a person-to-person transmission that pervades Sufism as well, and it's sort of what allows these scholars to be cohesive entities, both fiqh scholars and Sufi scholars and theologians and esotericists, and solving social problems, dealing with marital disputes, for example. And so I was thinking primarily through this notion of authority through tahqiq, right? An authority that was represented through the idea of knowledge verification or actualization, so that this was something that you had to put into practice to prove your worth. So that's one question, to sort of think about how you're defining scholarship theoretically. And then secondly would be a question that relates to the Islamic secular. If I'm reading Sherman Jackson's new book, right, about, he's sort of, you seem to be dismissing a little bit the notion of an Islamic secular as sort of a crude leveraging of clerical power by political authorities for their own particular gains. He might suggest that the Islamic secular is rather pushing back against this sort of crude division between church and state, and that in fact the clerical authorities always thought about themselves as having an influence over political power, even if they were very insistent on protecting their own independent financial well-being and independence from state authority. So that would be, a second question. Yeah, and I'll just leave it at there. Of course, I have other questions, but again, it was a fascinating read. Thank you for the presentation and for writing the book. And then after you then I'll open it up after you have a stab at any of those answers if you want, or if you want to decline, it's okay.
Actually, can I ask for some clarification, if you don't mind? So, when you talk about Islamic secular, can you tell me a little bit more? We're talking about the fact that, so we have a crude understanding of sort of church and state, right? And then that structure then defines how we look at the Muslim world rather problematically historically. But the idea is that why is it the secular? It's basically that the clerical domain has some overlap with the political zone and sees itself as active participants in, let's say, political activities?
Yeah, maybe others like Professor Guerrero could weigh in, or others that have read this argument closely. But what I understand is that, that we're talking about, so we're pushing against the kind of French version of laïcité.
Yeah.
But we're thinking about the way in which, for most of Islamic history, there was a sort of division of powers. It doesn't mean that because we're using the word secular, again, I think maybe Sherman Jackson is going too far to try to redeem the word secularism in this context, perhaps, but nonetheless, I think the kind of idea from the sort of American perspective that you have a division of influence, or division of power, or division of foundations of influence, I would say, is something that can be read onto the Islamic past in productive ways.
Yes, yes, of course it can, and of course the term secular is a bit, it's obviously a misnomer here. There is an understanding that all political power is going to be temporal, and you'll see this reflected in the hagiographical literature. That even if there happens to be a very close connection, someone is acting as a Shaykh al-Islam, that will not be mentioned in the hagiography. The hagiography will always be an occasional moment in which basically the king comes because they require some medical cure, right? In Unani medicine. Or some moment where, let's say, the king will walk from the citadel to the Sufi center in order to apologize on behalf of something, or in order to redeem himself. So there is a let's say a written division within the sources that is how this particular domain wants to see itself. But the actual structure of state versus this domain is actually not a very difficult structure for us to understand. Like if we, for example, in the American context, I'll often say this to my students, we'll take academia. Some are state schools, some are non-state schools, right? The majority are non-state schools. Most academics will just do their thing and they'll write their papers and they're going to go home. Some academics are going to show up in the White House or in the legislature. Other academics are going to wag their finger at those academics. Some will try to actually hang on to their coattails. Then within that academic domain, apart from that academic domain, you've got the domain of the therapists, right? You've got the domain of the priests, whoever is performing some sort of clerical services within the church. And you can add to that a couple of different, you can probably even add doctors and lawyers into that domain, I think reasonably so. Where again, you'll have perhaps a constitutional lawyer who will address an issue that actually has relevance for the state. The other person will be more concerned about resolving that dispute so you can get paid and move on with life. Now, apart from the fact that the economics of these two worlds are very different, the pre-modern world and the modern world, and the, let's say the bottom line is extremely different, that relationship should not be a very difficult relationship for us to comprehend. What I generally argue is that I'm not denying the involvement of, in fact, in many ways, pushing against, let's say, the politicization of the figure of Sir Hindi, for example, the way that he's been painted in academia for like the last 70, 80 years. But in a sense, I am eventually telling the political story. It's just that the starting point is to understand these networks on their own terms. These are the services that are being provided. These are the inputs and these are the outputs. Then within that, keeping that into view, then one can actually much better understand their political sensibilities, so that you don't end up with this sort of crude understanding of the, let's say, which comes out of the idealized Persian kingship, that you've got the domain of the scholars, sort of domain of the mobeds, who are then supporting the state domain, and the state domain basically keeps them happy, and somehow both are are looked at from the lens of political power. The first point that you had made, if you could kind of summarize that within a question, I would be really grateful. About the sort of multiple epistemologies that are.
Yeah, I guess the basic question was, how are you theorizing the Muslim scholar?
How am I theorizing? Well, the way that I would basically theorize the Muslim scholar in my world is to actually, it's what I do in chapter 3 and 4, is to look at the curriculum. And then the curriculum, and then finally the practical service that they're to provide. Now, in this case, it's actually rather, we have a unified framework that actually comes within Sir Hindi's own model of spiritual wayfaring, and it's an arc-shaped model, which is in fact rather interesting, where the arc is basically the human. I'm simplifying this in a very crude way. I would in fact wag a finger at myself for doing this, but as you're progressing in your spiritual activities, you enter into a state of basically, this is Wahdat al-Wujud, where there's nothing except God's presence and consciousness, and Sir Hindi, of course, will say that this is not a true state, but it's actually a state which is it's an experiential state. And then you continue into Zilya and Abdiya, where in your final stage you are really back down onto the ground, and you are bound by really the strictures of Scripture. In other words, that it is absolute, you realize that there is through the spiritual journey, that in the end it is the scholar who is going to translate the do's and don'ts in your everyday life to you. This actually does two things. First of all, it puts the world of the ecstatic mystic and the world of the sober mystic and the world of the scholar really on the same page as different sort of dimensions into one really experiential circuit. What it also does is it privileges the scholars as a sort of precondition to the spiritual path. So, from that vantage point, I would say that the curriculum that then is institutionalized that we were discussing yesterday under Sir Hindi, then really itself provides us a map of what that scholar should look like. And ultimately, the scholar is meant to be someone who's practical and engaged within the community.
Yeah, I think you answered it. One way of my sort of getting at the question when we ask, what would Ahmed Sir Hindi say about somebody like Muhammad Abdul, for example? What was he missing? And I think you've answered it. Yeah.
Thank you for sparing me that one.
Yeah. So I have one last question. Sorry. How do the Mujaddidi networks deal with later reformist networks that drew on similar heritages of knowledge, particularly that drew inspiration from Mujaddidi Sufis such as Shah Wali Allah thinking particularly like the Deobandi networks and
Yeah.
even the Taliban.
Yeah.
These are groups that are still operating side by side now. So how is this sheikh in Waziristan, for example, how did he think about the Taliban? Or can you walk us through some of the contestations over the legacy of Ahmed Sirhindi that are going on contemporarily?
So one thing you're going to note, if you're sort of reading the history of the Muslim world from Istanbul to Indonesia, is that whether it's Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia or, well, in fact, we can look at current several parties in current Turkish politics. We can look at the Deobandi movement is by and large a Chishti silsila byproduct, but they do like to cite Sirhindi, and they have a comfortable relationship with him. But you got, in fact, Nahdlatul Ulama in India also has the Habibandi, which is another, and then many of the Jadidi reformers in Central Asia, those who were not critical of the overall apparatus, were coming from Mujaddidi roots. In fact, many of those who were also critical were coming from Mujaddidi roots. So you're going to find a really interesting phenomenon in which so many different political movements. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the great modernist, grew up in the most important Sufi silsila. I mean, his first biography in his book on Delhi is actually on the Sheikh of Khalid al-Baghdadi, who was one of the biggest sort of educational reformers in the Ottoman Empire. This is Shah Ghulam Ali Dahlawi. So you have so many networks that are actually claiming authority from Sirhindi, which is actually the question that brought me here. And part of the reason is that it does provide at least on a superficial level, it does provide an easy framework. It provides an easy framework, and the critiques that Sirhindi, let's say, puts forward, two core critiques of the ulama, what's the word he uses? He says, like, for the narrow-minded scholar who the worm who lives under the rock, for him the sky is the bottom of the rock, right? Those who actually don't see the cosmos in its glory. And then the Sufi who has gone wayward, right? And that's the ultimate critique, is that tasawwuf has to be bound within correct Islamic practice. And therefore sobriety is extremely important. Those particular critiques are actually very, very useful. And that both of these things that he's critiquing, and we can argue, are very much in the fabric of our society today. So you mentioned three. You mentioned Shah Waliullah and Deoband are a little easier to handle here. Now, Shah Waliullah, of course, is the best way to look at him is he is a Mujaddidi himself. Obviously, some of his ijtihad goes beyond Sirhindi, but he and his father, Shah Abdul Rahim, would be emblematic of the core Zahiri, even though he is a Sufi in every sense of the term, and not that I deny his works in Tasawwuf, but their institutional building project is the very core revealed in rational sciences institution that then undergirds and provides the basis for the Mujaddidi project. In other words, chunk of the Mujaddidis who are functioning from Bukhara to the Deccan and further on are going to be connected to Shah Abdul Aziz or Shah Waliullah in their educational and initiatic lines. Deoband I would also see as an extension of that. Now Deoband, although the structure of Deoband is a colonial institution, structured as a colonial institution, it's coming from two sheikhs who are very important sheikhs within the Chishti silsila. And in many ways that in the first generation, second generation, I would argue even the sheikh in North Waziristan, he studied with Deobandi ulama. So Deoband factors prominently in providing again that foundation. Now of course you've got certain strands of Deoband who would be a little bit more problematic. But most of the Naqshbandis would argue that Deobandis are a comfort zone, because it is actually something that is bound within a certain rationality and within a certain understanding of very similar epistemology, and Deobandis likewise, it's quite similar. In fact, a lot of Mujahid networks that I visit, and they have madrasa attached to them, it ends up to be a Deobandi madrasa. Taliban are more complicated. You want to talk? Right, okay. So the Taliban are coming up as a countercurrent post what would you call it? There's a word that's used for this, but it's a kind of counter movement to all of, in fact, a lot of the Islamist networks that emerge in the time of the Afghan Civil War, who aren't able to offer answers to the problems and are actually engaged, in fact, highly intellectual in terms of their understanding of what a Muslim state should look like in the modern sense of it, but totally immersed in the violence and the culture of violence, and not able to provide a practical solution. So this countercurrent emerges, and the countercurrent, I would argue, is not really, it's not an intellectual countercurrent, and it's not meant to be. It's coming from generally, lots of generalizations here, the underclasses. Mullah Omar himself had a very brief education. Now, a lot of these people, because they are coming from rural institutions in Afghanistan, have familial connections with the Naqshbandi and the Chishti and several other silsilas. Naqshbandi being a key silsila. Several of the major figures actually have spent their early years associated with some Sufi center or the other. Now, because of almost the haphazard way in which ideology and state formation comes together in Afghanistan in 1996, and let's say 1997, when you've got this short-lived constitutional project for the Afghan state, you're seeing almost a mishmash of various movements with a core, again, this is gross simplification, with a core aim is to provide a state that can actually prevent day-to-day rape from happening. Remember, one of the first things the Taliban does publicly is to hang a rapist from the turret of a tank, right? So their first goal was to actually provide the stability to years of some of the worst war that the world has ever seen. Now, the degree to which they got involved into it afterwards, I'm not going to get into. But so within that, they have a there's much more fluidity. You don't really have, you do have some scholars who are of a slightly higher rank, but then a lot of the decision makers don't have the subtleties of, let's say, a Deobandi scholar who has a practical feet on the ground and has dealt with day-to-day problems. And then of course the moment that they come up, the state's about to be formed, and then you end up with a war situation. I mean, this does not really yield a systematic relationship with either state formation or with ideology. But because Afghanistan has such a deep connection to the Salasil, the Talibs will have a very hard time critiquing in fact, the Mujaddidis, the Qadiris, and the Chishtis. The Chishtis they will critique in terms of Sama. So in the Taliban era, you had certain centers that were, at least the Sama activities were shut down. But by and large, the Naqshbandi orders were kept intact. So again, it's not seen as something that is particularly problematic.
Thank you. All right, so we've been talking too long. Other questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you for being here.
I just had some comment on this question about Taliban. Like, I had some more questions, but just a comment. Like, recently, after Taliban took over Afghanistan, I personally know a few of the ulama who are connected with the Silsila.
Yeah.
They went in a group to Afghanistan to have some discussions with them. Like, I personally know them. So, that just reminded me of this. Like, they have some connections with Taliban and they wouldn't be Pakistan, so they don't even need visas. So, there's lots of relationship.
And you saw the way that they were received, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, again, with this, like, I would caution both of us here, because this is the realm of politics as well, right? Because you also do have, and it's important not to put this part aside, because we often look at the text just in the form of the text and not with the political situation in which they're occurring. Here you have the Taliban, and we can talk about this in the 18th century context as well, with intellectual networks flourishing there, but they are trying to create a coalition. Now, when you're creating a coalition, you will sometimes draw upon figures of authority and give them that certain amount of respect. In fact, I remember back in Kabul, there was a delegation of scholars that were visiting, who wasn't even before Ghani, and Ghani serving tea to all of these scholars, right? Does he really want to serve tea to them? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not going to gauge what's in his heart. And then you will now have a reception of the kind that we saw with the Taliban when this delegation came through, right? And so we have to also realize that there's political theater, and God only knows what's in the hearts of human beings. Right?
Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Professor Ziad.
Thank you so much.
College of Physical Intelligence, and Professor Wright for starting this off on such a productive discussion. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't had a chance yet, but I found this journey really fascinating. And I guess I have two questions. The first one has to do with the political theology that you presented us briefly. It's one that is familiar to us from other contexts, this relation between the hidden and the manifest caliphate. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that. So first of all, what exactly was the manifest caliphate in this time in this region? Was there a suggestion that people were looking at the Ottoman Sultan as a figure of political authority as well, or was the manifest caliphate perhaps a more generic term to think about political authority? And then how exactly was the relationship between these two caliphs, or these two caliphates, the hidden and the manifest, both conceptualized and practiced? Okay, so are these scholars written about it? You mentioned there was a degree of political patronage also, but maybe you could say a little bit more about how these scholars thought about the political and whether they sought to entertain relations with political authorities, or on the other hand, keep away from them. That's the first question.
Oh my goodness, okay, the first is $1 million question, all right. Please.
The second one is also a broad one about the decline narrative in which you are intervening. I mean, this is a complex narrative, and I think it's complex because it has both Muslim and colonial lineages, and these lineages only partly overlap.
Only partly
Right.
overlap, yes.
And I think one of the problems is, I think you suggested, is the fact that the criteria by which decline is measured is often not very clear, and that the narrative might also be a little bit too overarching. But I wonder whether you could elaborate on what exactly is the intervention you're making, because are you telling us to move away from decline altogether,
No.
or are you changing its periodization? I noticed that there was a talk about the fall and rise of Bukhara's academies, for example, right? And are you inviting us to think about the intellectual flourishing that you're depicting in terms of circulation of texts and ideas, or in terms of institutional building and renewal, or perhaps also in some more concrete advances in specific religious or rational sciences? I think the focus in your presentation was on the first two, but I wonder whether we should rewrite the history of the intellectual history of the Muslim world differently if we pay greater attention to these methods. So thank you very
How
much.
much time do you have?
Yeah,
Okay, all right. Okay, now you asked me two sort of thesis-sized questions, and very, very important questions, so thank you for that, and I'll try my best. All right, so political theology and the manifest caliphate and the hidden caliphate. Now, I'm going to argue that really that structure of the manifest and the hidden really should be seen coming into the fore after the assassination, the martyrdom of Sayyidina Ali, and the events of Karbala. That you immediately have a delegitimization of all political authority, whether you eventually become, whether you're proto-Sunni or proto-Shia or so on and so forth, wherein spiritual authority is no longer vested within the political authority, and it's well understood, especially with the rise of the Umayyads initially, that we are dealing with an authority that is generally not just lacks spiritual authority, but kind of is the antithesis of that, right? In many ways, in the Manichaean vision of the world, represents really the downfall of everything and the within the created world. So I would actually argue that this system of looking at it from the point of view of these two separate spheres should actually be dictating, and you know, it's a very common system. It's something that a lot of us come in touch with, but it should be taken a lot more seriously. Now, why do I deal with this in the 18th and the 19th century? Because it becomes so much more pronounced. Because we've got a period in which you do have a not just a breakdown of, let's say, or the setting up of multiple states, but you've got a crisis in authority and sovereignty. You've got the old states that are resting upon the sovereignty of the Mongol Khan, they're resting upon the idea of the Shah, the idea in certain cases of protecting of holy sites, and these now have broken down in favor of other dynasties that completely lack that kind of authority. Some of the dynasties are actually brand new tribal confederacies who may have even defined themselves a generation earlier. So, within this period, you actually see almost the mechanics by which this particular network, and it is, the first part is to understand that it's a network. We are not talking about an isolated Kabul, an isolated Istanbul, we're talking about a constant movement, and the network part is essential to understand that it is a thriving organism. Certainly with contestation in between, but it is a thriving organism. And we also need to know the contours of that organism, how far it spreads, and how far beyond Kazan, for example, does it spread, or Crimea. So if we understand this as an organism, the 18th and 19th century gives us a very, very interesting moment in which, almost by default, these states lacking authority end up recognizing that these particular institutions are far more important as a kind of glue that holds this world together. So it's a continuation of former processes, so I don't want to pretend that it's something entirely new, but what we will see is that each of the states are importing in these scholars, giving them land. Whatever fallow land there is there, they know that they've also got the agrarian technology so that they can actually set up the land and make the land arable. Like handing acres and acres of land over to support these institutions, which, because they know that it's almost like a, sorry to use a very, very crude, deeply problematic, but it's almost like a sort of, diplomatic corps that they sort of require in order to survive in this particular new world order. And that they know that in order to also exert their authority, they need to have an academic and spiritual base. When you have in fact, a descendant of Mujaddid al-Thani in your city, that's social capital right there. That's spiritual capital right there, and you will make it a point. I talked about this Munshi who travels with Moorcroft. When he goes to Kokand, the first thing the king of Kokand does is says, "Can you please become the principal of our chief college?" So everyone understands that this is really, really important. It's lending them both that social capital, and it's giving them a whole sequence of functions. Again, what also becomes more pronounced in the 18th and 19th centuries are the process I was talking about before, the degree to which you will see single institutions and silsilas that are being supported by two warring states exactly at the time the war is going on. So in other words, there is an understanding that these are, yes, you will have certain individuals playing factional politics, for sure. Maybe a particular Mujaddidi is in favor of the king of Uratsepe, someone else in Khojan, someone else in Kokand, and so on and so forth. But by and large, there is an understanding that that these networks are to be supported if we want our state to thrive within this world order. Now, in terms of conceptual, not many people are writing about this. So within the writings of the Mujaddidis themselves, you are actually not going to see much of a political domain. It's quite fascinating. Within the chronicles, occasionally some of them will include the Sufi sheikh who ties the turban, or maybe the miracle that happens before they enter into some conquest or consecrate a city, or so on and so forth. But by and large, the Sufi silsilas are not engaged with court questions. It is almost an insult to be engaged with the court, although some of them will do it, and some of them will do it publicly. So if you're a qadi, that's fine. At least you are, even if you have some earning or some relationship to the state, at least you're performing the function that is a valid function. So by and large, yes, are they conceptualizing it in terms of that question? No, they're not. Which is why I felt the need to sort of like draw that particular conceptualization, especially as it becomes pronounced in the 18th and 19th centuries, based on the type of reality that the sources are bringing out. So in other words, let's be, because most of this period is dealt with purely from the court, we generally have a feeling that these ulama are functioning within their own domains, that they are most of this is based on European records for Central Asia and for Afghanistan and what's most of Pakistan today. And you'll have this idea that they are sort of superstitious and working in their own domains, and so on and so forth, and not really performing much of a function. So one of the core points of my project is actually to understand the nuts and bolts. Like really what happens in a tribal area? What is this scholar doing in the tribal areas? What is their functional role? Why are they there? How are they able to get to Siberia? I mean, the distance between Siberia to Bukhara is the distance between Bukhara to Bengal, except through snow and cold, right? So why exactly are these movements happening? And to whose benefit is it? And how are the communities transforming when you actually end up having a more overt form of authority that's vested upon these Sufi shuyukh? Now, in terms of the Ottomans, no. It's not until really, let's say, Yaqub Beg's time, I'm thinking in Xinjiang, where you'll have coins minted in the late 1860s under the name of the Ottoman Sultan, where there's and I'm mentioning Yaqub Beg and the Yaqub Beg revolt in particular because it has a Naqshbandi dimension to it. Although he didn't have the best relationship with his sheikh. It's a state that sets up in China in the 1860s. It's in Xinjiang, and they're very generally very supportive of the Mujaddidis and several other silsilas. And at that stage, you will have some authority vested upon the Ottomans. Other than that, no, they're all really seen as, I hesitate to use the word illegitimate because that almost implies that some sort of revolt is intended, but they're not seen as legitimate, and they're not seen as they're seen as states that are meant to decline and fall with the movement of time. But, which brings us to the second question, time, but the movement of time is not dictated by them. The movement of time is being dictated elsewhere. And now I'm going to use this as a segue into the next question, into the decline narrative. That you're absolutely right, there are two decline narratives. One narrative basically dictates that after the prophetic time, it's all downhill. Until basically Imam Mehdi's time, right? And it's downhill, but with a few mujaddids, so it's a kind of chart that kind of goes like this, or a little like kind of wave pattern that's heading downwards. But the mujaddidis, of course, see time slightly differently. There is a great cosmological changes involving the reality of the Prophet and the Kaaba. I'm sure you'll be able to shed light on this, that are actually bound within measured time. So at the time of the year 1000, and this is not Hijri, but after the Prophet's death, there is actually a particular moment where the world is bereft of prophetic spiritual guidance, and then where there's certain new roles that need to be assumed in order to keep the world running. Of course, sainthood and prophethood are not the same thing. It will never be even a fraction of the change the Prophet has to bring about. But it will be some form of a great revival that's going to happen. So let's just say in the Mujaddidi, it's a downhill with a large spike at year 1000, and then that spike is somehow sustained by a group of scholars and saints who revive the Sunnah upon the year 1000. Now, what do I feel about the decline narrative? I certainly will say that the decline narrative that is defined by the size of the empire it's coming entirely out of Orientalist scholarship. No one cared. I mean, Karbala is the high point. Karbala, in terms of it's a spiritual, let's say, awakening within the Muslim context. From a political context, it's about the lowest point that you can possibly get. So there is really no correlation between, let's say, righteousness and spirituality and political power and the growth of empire. And now, another fallacy, of course, is that most of these empires are highly decentralized empires. So, frankly, from a governance standpoint, what's happened in the 18th and 19th century is not really that different from what happens when Tabaristan or Egypt or other regions get incorporated into the Umayyad state. So there is this understanding, and then of course we also measure it in terms of when are we producing things that, like astrolabes, that look like something that's coming out of 19th century by its mere form of its appearance, and then we somehow give Baghdad a very particular role, and then we sort of work our way downwards from there. So what I'm arguing is that there are transformations within the way in which knowledge is conceived, but we need to be much more, and I would say sort of take these region by region and period by period to look at, I would say, the moment that we have enough studies that are cross-regional, and we have enough sort of micro and macro studies, can we make sense of the different ways to actually measure a rise and decline. Now, I, of course, read this book, and I do something very different in the next book, which is on Mujaddidi, the female leadership in the Afghan Mujaddidi silsila, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. I have a very different rubric for decline. But when I look at decline here, I'm talking about connectivity mostly. Because it's very hard to measure, because when you've got a pastoral nomadic institution, we were discussing this yesterday, this great Deobandi institution that I was studying, supposed to be founded well pre-Deoband, 120 years earlier, and I just discovered after God knows how many interviews, and looking at the books that were produced there, that it was a peripatetic institution with no building until the 1940s. So it's very difficult to measure rise and decline, because what's happening in the pastoral nomadic zones, that's a huge chunk of the world that virtually none of us understand, because I've never been a pastoral nomad. And it's not until I spent 3 months in the desert that I realized that I need to understand the way the environment works in order to be able to gauge what's happening in that institution. So until we get there, I think rise and decline is a little bit of a useless question to ask, or at least we need to hold off on it. In terms of connectivity, the type of things that I focus on are varied. Mostly great game politics. The rise of Amir Abdul Rahman, who basically, the creation of the new nation state of Afghanistan that's meant to basically break Russian and British sphere of influence. That's a key point. Another point is the introduction of American cotton crop into what is today Uzbekistan. Because all of a sudden now, you are no longer reliant on cotton products that are coming from the south, and the trade networks are mapped onto the spiritual networks. So all of a sudden, the people like Imam Raza Zaghori, who are carrying their flocks and also carrying cloth, are no longer required to basically go north and south of the Oxus. And then, of course, again, with the early 20th century, then the Oxus becomes a militarized barrier. And then you've got the Grand Line and various things like this. But the factors are several, but I tie most of them to great game politics, in parallel with, of course, the whole processes of modernity that end up sort of devaluing the knowledge that is produced within these institutions.
Okay, I think we're at time. Yeah. I want to thank you all for attending. Professor Lombard, any final words?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank both of you for an excellent discussion, a stimulating discussion. Thank you for the presentation. I learned a ton. This was wonderful. I can't thank you enough. And I'd just like to also invite everybody, if you want to continue, have other questions that you feel weren't addressed, please, we have some refreshments out back, and so you are free to just join us for some coffee and maybe just enough to make a lunch of it, if you're not too hungry. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.